What we have to say is important. So, now, what do we say? And to help guide us with that, I would like to introduce, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rob Robinson.
Can you hear me if I don't use the microphone?
No.
No? All right. And the television people, okay, they won't hear you. Okay, so basically, I think the most important purpose for this evening is to make sure that we're responsive to the needs that you have here. And so it'd be very helpful if you don't leave the room this evening with unanswered questions. So if you have anything you want to ask, it's probably likely that 4, 5, 6, maybe more other people are going to have the same question. And if there's anything you want to add from your experience that you feel will benefit other people, then I think that's going to be very important. You know, I think that when you get a group like this, it's the number of questions and the number of ideas that come from people that empower a program like this. So if you have questions, will you ask?
Yes.
Very good. No one's going to be shy. All right. And really the purpose of this is not to create anxiety. Sometimes a lot of times when you see statistics and slides and, you know, people walk away from some of these workshops with anxiety. And the real purpose of this is actually to enhance the mindfulness and the presence we have as parents or teachers when we work with young people. So it's really about trying to get us focused and in the right position so that we say the right things and we say the things we're saying clearly, and we look at the various forms of the way we say things. It's not just verbal communication. How we speak in terms of how we behave with alcohol in our own life, the modeling that we have, the messaging that we have, the social media messaging, the commercial messaging. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we can comment on to our kids about what they're exposed to and what they see. So there's a voice of reason in this and a voice of presence in this whole piece when we interact with them. So I want to start with just 2 quick quotes because lots of times when we run into jams in our life, people panic. And they feel overwhelmed and anxious about things that they experience. And this Peter DeVries is an author who's written a number of books relative to parenting, family life, kids stuff. And he said, who among us is mature enough for offspring before the offspring themselves arrive? The value of marriage is not that the adults produce children, but that children produce adults. And I think, you know, finally when we have kids, it's probably the best example that the party's over, and now we have to start to grow up, and we have to begin to become conscious ourselves about, you know, what we're doing and how we're doing it. And we really do get a chance to become much more conscious about our role and the mission we have. And the other slide, and I share this a lot with people I see in my practice, and I work with, you know, for the last 35 or 40 years, we've been working with parents and children in the practice that we have, along with Gina and the work that she does, you know, trying to teach the fact that, you know, there's no real coming to consciousness without pain. It's easy if nothing bad ever happens, but if nothing bad ever happens, there's no way to ever wake up or become resilient. And so resilience in parenting, resiliency, is really built around the challenges we deal with. It's, I guess if you walk down the street every day and you never experience any problems, you just walk down the street and don't think about it. But if you walk down the street one day and you fall in a hole, the next day you walk down the street, you're much more alert about where you're stepping and what you're doing. So I think Carl Jung had a great point. You know, if we're running into these challenges, it's not something to fear and have anxiety about. It's so that we can kind of become more alert, become more aware, and really focus on the presence of our message with our kids. So, this is going to be the last slide you see of the program, and it'll be the first slide. I'm hoping that what we cover here this evening prompts some questions, but adds to an underlying common sense about this topic. Because here's another thing that I've noticed in working with people. I believe that when we get the anxiety out of the way, and we get our past histories out of the way, and we get the trauma and tough things that have happened in our life out of the way, and we get egos out of the way, that there really is a vast depth of common sense and knowledge, a stronger and wiser heart that every single human being has. And I think the problem with accessing that sometimes is our minds get in the way with storytelling and anxiety creating, and it interferes with common sense. So I'm hoping that the stuff we covered tonight will just add to that body of common sense, and we can use that as a reference when we're dealing with the kids. All right, so national statistics that are kind of similar to what we have locally. 2015 Youth Risk Assessment Survey, 15,000 people in this, so it's a significant size sample. 33% of the participants drank some amount of alcohol in the previous year. 18% reported binge drinking. I'm going to comment on that in a bit, which is really a product of some impulse control and decision making, obviously with underdeveloped thinking. When you're in middle school, your brain's not fully mature until you're about 20 years old, so there's still a lot of cognitive distortions that are involved in that. And there's also a physiological predisposition for binge drinking that I think you'll find interesting, and that has been written about heavily in terms of damaged chromosome on an allele in our DNA. 8% reported driving after drinking, and 20% reported riding with a driver who had been drinking. So there's some work relative to decision making that we need to really kind of work with and develop with our kids. 1 in 16s report binge drinking, and this is an interesting statistics, and then we'll be off this statistics. Only 1% of parents believe their teen binge drinks. So 16% of them are binge drinking, and only 1% of us even think it's happening, right? So there's the tendency, I think sometimes, again, these filters of anxiety that sometimes kind of distort what we see, right? So it's trying to be as present as we can be relative to what is happening, not panic, tap into the common sense, and then use that to inform what we do with our kids. 21% of high school students binge drank in the last 30 days in this study. 90% of alcohol consumed by teens involves binge drinking. There were 4,300 underage deaths caused by excessive drinking every year, and 189,000 ER visits in 2015 were related to drinking. So it's a significant issue. And you know, again, it's not just sampling the alcohol, but there's a significant problem with how it's being used. Right? So there's the problem of using it at this age when the brain is developing, and then there's the problem of how it's being used, which is the binge drinking issue, which we'll comment on. So who are we teaching? Who are we parenting, and who are we working with at this stage? Well, in Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages theory, he talked about the fact that we're at a place where there's identity versus role confusion. This occurs during adolescence between the ages of approximately 12 and 18. And during this stage, adolescents explore their independence and develop a sense of self. So what could possibly go wrong? So there's this normal movement away from control and into wanting to do their own thing and seek independence. And at the same time that's happening, they're trying to begin to figure out, who am I? What am I about? What is my identity? And the messaging in that and the narrative in that, as it stands, is a very, very, very important place that we want to have a clear and consistent intervention. And as we go through some of these slides, I'll try to share with you some examples of how that works and what can be done about it, because it's a powerful place that we can really do a lot of good. Okay, so why are young people using alcohol, and what is the context of this part of the journey? So there's risk-taking naturally. A lot of kids are risk-taking at this stage because, again, the brain is developing rapidly at this stage. It's probably the quickest period of development, or the most intensive period of development in brain physiology in someone's entire life. And at this point, at the same time there's all this development going on physiologically, there's also some significant distortions in the way that people think. So even the brightest kids, even the brightest children with the highest IQs are having difficulty thinking abstractly until around the age of 16 or 17 years old. So there's not a bringing together of all the information related to decision making. You know, so you have conversations with them at this age and you say, you didn't think of that? You didn't think anything could happen? No, I didn't think about that. So there's a lot of impulse control stuff, basically due to the fact that kids have a lot of black and white thinking. There's overgeneralized thinking. You know, there's lots of kids doing it. What's the big deal? It's normal, right? Without any consideration to the other side of the argument. And even with the brightest kids, there's these distortions. And then there's social pressures and belonging. You know, a narrative oftentimes is set at lunch tables. And kids talking to one another. People communicating on social media. Conversations that go in hallways. People getting in touch with one another about messaging about drinking. And people, kids, young kids begin to believe that in order to belong, I've got to participate in this. And that if I don't, then there's something wrong with me. So there's a distortion here that if you make the healthy decision, sometimes it's the unhealthy move from the standpoint of being able to experience a sense of belonging with the peer group you're in. And then the perception of alcohol use changes. Before age of 9, it's not viewed as being, it's viewed as being a bad thing. Kids generally, before the age of 9 years old, see it as a bad thing. And then, by the time they reach 13 or later, it's not viewed as poorly or as badly as it was when they were 9. Any ideas about why that might be? Any guesses? Yeah, I mean, part of it has to do with developing, but the other part has to do, you know, as they get older, there's more exposure to the broader social group. And unfortunately, I think you see these numbers changing in middle school. In my opinion, just from what I've been able to garnish from the people I work with, and which is not a huge population, but I work with many people in the studies you read, you know, social media has a lot to do with this. Right? People are beginning to develop narratives about who they are based on a story that's being told, for example, on a Facebook page, which is a distortion in itself. So this inner narrative begins to start changing because perceptions are beginning to be developed about what's cool, what isn't cool, what helps you belong, what doesn't help you belong. And there's a lot of this stuff that goes on that doesn't get shared with parents. But that's why it's important to look at what's happening in the social media realm, right? Which we'll talk about again in a little bit. So I'm going to bring all these up here. Not everybody's born with the same brain. And it's not just intellectual functioning, but it's the physiologies. No two brains are alike. And physiologies can drive personalities, right? The problem with some of these things up here, and I have a real problem with some of this, but I had to talk about it because there are trends about alcohol use. What I want to say is that every single profile up here does not mean that if someone has ADD, for example, they're going to become an alcoholic and a problem drinker. That I don't want you to see in this. I think what we want to see in this is that there are different physiologies that can predispose kids to being a more at-risk population. For example, and I think what you have to think about when you're looking at this slide, I think you have to think two things. Number one, alcohol use as a medicinal purpose, and then alcohol use as a boundary solvent. And I think alcohol is a very powerful boundary solvent. For example, if you feel intimidated, if you feel shy, and you drink, you suddenly become the life of the party. And if you're stressed out and angry and you don't want to connect with anybody anymore, you drink and then it puts walls up. So boundaries are involved with alcohol use, and so are medicinal purposes. That if we're hyper and stressed and I have a few drinks, I alter my state of consciousness. If I'm an aggressive person and I drink, I become even more powerful. If I'm hyperactive, I can use alcohol and calm down. If I'm depressed, I can feel a bit of elation for a brief period of time. If I'm withdrawn, I can drink and be more social, less social anxiety. And if I'm anxious, it can calm me down. But I think what's really critical, and what I've seen over the course of my career as a therapist working with kids and families and adolescents for so many years, is the incredible, I guess I would call it the incredible aptitude on the part of parents to label their children. So sometimes when kids come in or adolescents come in, there's really this desire to kind of, so what do you think? What's the diagnosis? How would you label this child? And I think that's probably one of the most dangerous things we can do, because that labeling begins to seep into the narrative of the child, and then all of a sudden, this is how the child sees themselves. Because the way it works is thoughts about ourselves become stories that we begin to tell ourselves. And then those stories become filters through which we see everything around us. And it's a distortion. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and this is a very powerful thing to teach young people and for us to see, is that things don't have any meaning except for the meaning that we give it. So I was working with a young boy recently, and this guy has significant learning disabilities. And he was labeled as a kid who was a SPED, for example. And this kid was so, I'm going to probably use the word, I don't think it's an exaggeration. The kid was, his self-narrative was so damaged by that label that he would wait until everybody went to class, and then he'd sneak in so he didn't have his friends who weren't in special ed classes see him ducking into a special ed class. And the kid was clinically depressed when he came in. That was his narrative. So he acted based on how he saw himself and how he saw the world. He saw the world as a highly critical place, and a place that he really didn't belong like other people because of the damage of this label. And so we started working together and talking about the inner narrative, what you tell yourself about things, how that influences what you do. And as it turned out, over the course of about 3 years of working with this young man, he's graduating from a local high school this year. He got accepted to college. He's no longer depressed, and he's a completely different person. And what made him different is that his narrative changed. He found things that were strengths in himself. And that whole piece began to change the way he saw himself, and it changed his life. And so if we can get to what's the inner narrative, and we can get to what are you telling yourself about things, and we can understand how that filter distorts what they see in themselves and what they see in the world, It's enormously powerful point of change. So, the bottom line on that is we manifest that which we see. If we see ourselves as being not belonging, we see ourselves as somehow as not as good as others, if we see ourselves as being anything other than a viable, valuable human being, the mind and body will manifest that narrative. It's impossible not to think negatively and not to have that show up in your physiology. And then genetics. So, you guys probably already know this. I mean, it's common sense. I mean, if you have several alcoholic family members in the family, there's 4 to 10 times more probability that you may have a problem with alcohol use. There's a genetic predisposition. It's clearly linked. And there's also, as it turns out, a genetic link to binge drinking. So it's not so much, when I work with people who have alcohol problems, it's not so much the fact that you drink, underage drinking, not cool, I'm talking about adults here just for a moment, but how you drink. That when you start drinking, can you stop? And you can see this in people if you have some people with alcohol issues, because there's a strong percent, about 34% of people who are alcoholics and have significant addiction to alcohol, there's a genetic variation on the allele on chromosome 11. And that can be genetically handed down, and the chances of getting this damaged chromosome are twice as high if you have both parents who have alcohol issues, right? And what does this do? This damaged chromosome actually serves as a barrier for the brain to register that's enough. So people who have this damaged chromosome in their DNA typically begin to drink in a compulsive way. So one beer, one glass of wine, one drink, immediately chug down, leads to another, and another, and another, and there's no shut-off switch. So when young people binge drink, I'm not suggesting that that's why they're binge drinking. Lots of them are binge drinking because of the cognitive distortions, like what could possibly go wrong. And everybody does it, that's cool. But some, in a high percentage pool of individuals, young people, may be binge drinking because there is this inherent genetic damage to this chromosome. So that's an important thing to know, and an important thing to use in our messaging with kids. Not every brain's the same. And if there's an uncle, a parent, a grandfather, an aunt, a mother, a grandmother, bunches of people in family histories that have alcohol issues, that's an important narrative. That's an important thing to talk about. Here's what happened, and here's what does happen when there's been so many of us in our family who've had those problems, right? You gotta have more respect for what's going on than the average person who gets a free DNA pass on this. And then there's the environmental risk factors. I'll bring all these up. So, environmentally with parents, with us, I love this little play on these two words. One little shift from nowhere becomes now here. And I think that's really true. You know, so often, because of all the distractions and all the stuff we deal with in our culture nowadays, our minds are filled with tons of content. And you can see it everywhere, where people are out together, or parents are dealing with their kids, and no one's present. The body's there, but there's no one connecting. Just go out to dinner. No one's talking. What are they doing? Right. Not there. Right? Come home from work, there's a million things to do, tons of stuff going on externally, right? It's distracting. Life situations and life content can be incredibly distracting. Stress can be distracting, right? So we also want to look whether we're present or not, but also whether there's positive or negative sentiment override in the climate of the house. How does it feel to be here? As it turns out, positive sentiment override in relationships and families allows there to be plenty of room and space for dealing with issues, for problems. When there's negative sentiment override, there's no patience and there's no room to deal with it. There's instant flooding. Why? Because the mind is full. There's no space for it. So the more encouragement and the more positive sentiment override there is through things like giving encouragement, telling people we love one another, being supportive and developing a positive narrative, it makes room for things that have to be dealt with. And that's the key. Where's the space for stuff that comes up? The stuff that's going to happen is inevitable, right? Whether or not parents are turned toward each other rather than away. Similar to being present. Am I doing things to make people in this family feel loved and cared about? And our histories, can be a filter in distorting what we see now. And, when we see our kids struggling with something, if we had challenges when we were younger with peer relationships, academic challenges, rejections, being picked on, that stuff that our kids deal with leads to activation of our own pain. And all of a sudden, we're not just dealing with the child's pain anymore. Now we're seeing it through a historic filter, our own pain, if you will, that distorts what we're seeing. It amplifies it. So what happens? The whole thing's treated like a huge crisis. There's a lot of overreacting. There's a tremendous amount of emotional flooding. I have in my office pulse oximeters that I have there for a reason. Because when people come in to talk to one another, sometimes things blow up quickly. Not because I allow fighting in my office, but it blows up because there's this activation of pain. Put the pulse oximeter on, the heart rate's up at about 128 beats a minute. And it's impossible to problem solve when your heart rate's at 128 beats a minute. You're in fight or flight. You're in a survival mode. That's not reasoning, it's not thinking. So what's the pulse oximeter do? Okay, we'll talk about this again when the heart rate's down below 90 beats a minute. Think of something to make yourself feel calm. Take some deep breaths. And as they do, things begins to lower. Calm is restored. Problem solving can be initiated. So histories are important for parents to work on because that can become a filter through which we see our kids, and it distorts a lot of things that we see. Peers, obviously, huge influence environmentally. I put Walmart wisdom in because just last week I was working with a couple guys, young people, freshmen in high school, and they went into Walmart. I'm not going to say where, but they went into Walmart, and the person I'm working with in the practice, freshman in high school, his job was to be the point guard to distract the Walmart workers while the 6 other friends were able to steal 30 packs out of Walmart. This is a well-orchestrated plan. And no one got caught. So what happens to the storytelling in the 14-year-old brain? Any guesses? It's, wow, we're really good. That was amazing. Able to steal a couple 30 packs, no one gets nailed. Pretty cool. Story we can tell around school. Problem is the story got told around school and the guidance counselor picked up on it and the kid ends up in my office. But this turned into a very valuable lesson. Because all you have to do in a situation like this has nothing to do with brilliant psychological interventions that require advanced degrees. It's a simple question. What were you thinking? Honest. Not a flooded, angry, you better tell me what you were thinking, but no, I'm not kidding. Seriously, what were you thinking? How cool it would be. We wanted the beer. The end justified the means. I said, can you think of anything that could have possibly gone wrong? Honestly. And then, list them all. I said, okay. So, inside, there's this stronger, wiser self. Where was he? Because we all have a stronger, wiser part of us. We have different personas, all of us do. Kids especially, but adults as well. Where's the stronger, wiser guy? You came up with all the right reasons about why you shouldn't have done it. You had every risk. I could not have done a better job at outlining the risks that you just did. In fact, would you let me use this in future therapy sessions with people? It was magnificent. I'm writing them all down on a sheet of paper. I'm not kidding. About 11 things. So, I didn't give him those. He knew it. There's the stronger, wiser part. Is this guy, the stronger, wiser guy, going to navigate you through more of these, or are you going to do the I want to belong at any cost with my friends guy? What guy's going to navigate you through this? There was nothing more that needed to be said. Point made. And it wasn't a lecture about, are you kidding me? Are you crazy? Are you nuts? No, the lecture had nothing to do with the lecture. It was, you have a stronger, wiser part. We need to amplify that. I want you to come back the next time and tell me how that guy in you got you through the past 2 weeks. Tell me how that guy showed up, what he did, and what was the thinking. Peers, normally, naturally, become much like a second family to kids, adolescents. What they think sometimes can end up superseding what the parents think. And I think one of the most important things we can talk to our kids about is, okay, you're in a situation, people want to do X, Y, and Z. How do you think yourself through that, and what do? How do you opt out of that? It's front loading. We can't assume that just because our child might get A's and everything's been a pretty easy ride all along, that they aren't going to be faced with those kinds of pressures at some point. So we front load. Opting out is not copping out. That's a really wise and smart thing to do. And we don't tell them why it's wise and smart. We get them to tell us why it's wise and smart. Why is that a wise and smart thing to do? And they will tell you. And that comes from their stronger side. Commercials are endless. I mean, the one in the Super Bowl and when the NFL playoffs were running was amazing, right? So that you got the dilly thing going, right? And so the wizard, remember the wizard guy? He's with the king, and the king is telling the wizard, turn that into Bud Light and turn that into Bud Light. And the wizard's like, hey, king, like I can like do anything. All you want is beer? That's all I want. Bud Light, right? Nothing is more important in the world than Bud Light. There's messaging in that. That's only one example. There's tons. They use young people in alcohol ads. You know, the Corona thing, sitting on the beach in the Adirondack chair, lying in there, sunsetting. It's all very romantic. It's very cool, right? But we have to watch that stuff with our kids, and we've got to counteract some of that messaging. That's an important thing to talk about. And then there's the social media, what kids need to see on social media. And what I mean by that is we have to let them know that what they're seeing is an illusion, right? I mean, Facebook, for example, is an ad about someone or someone's life and someone's family that doesn't show Timmy coming home drunk and puking on the living room rug, right? Or bringing the report card home with F's. It's all this illusion about this messaging that we want out there about our lives, right? And kids see this stuff. And so now they're finally beginning to do studies on people who troll through Facebook and other forms of social media and spend a good portion of their discretionary time doing that and finding out that, wow, they're depressed. Yeah, because it's crazy, right? So what do kids do? They see a story, the Facebook story, living color, pictures of, you know, on the beach, everybody having fun, right? And they then tell themselves a story about the story they're seeing, and they compare their life to what they're seeing on Facebook. And they're using that to build a narrative about who they are, when what they're looking at is an enormous distortion in the first place. That's important for them to know. People don't see that all the time. So, and by the way, posting pictures of underage drinking is not good common sense, right? So we definitely want to have a narrative about, you know, don't take pictures of yourself drinking and then post it on something that then shows up in the school the next day and then you're expelled. That can happen that quickly. And then it's like, oh God, right? Forgot about that, right? We got to front load these things so that at least it's in there. Okay, so I just want to be real quick on enabling. You know, when something shows up in the form of problem drinking or drug use, you know, these are the forms of enabling. You know what the trouble with enabling is? The trouble with enabling is that enabling and loving someone, they're very closely related. It's a very fine line. That's why it's so hard not to do it, right? But we have to watch that carefully because we don't want to cooperate with the stuff and want to try to get in the way of it, right? And so messaging becomes clear in that. You have this in your handouts. I won't spend too much time on that. All right, so I want to talk for the next probably 10 minutes on parenting with presence. And I want to say, first of all, that parenting with presence is not helicopter parenting and snowplow parenting. We know all about that stuff, right? Hovering over everything that happens, being in charge of everything, you know, getting rid of all obstacles so your life is free and easy and coast clear to the end and everything's beautiful. It's not that. All right, so the best way I can describe what parenting with presence, which is going to be the next 5 or 6 slides, is the awareness with a capital A, or the presence with a capital P, that underlies the seeing and doing of parenting. It's the part of parenting where we're present and we're just in that step dealing with that in the most non-distorted way that we can deal with it. So, whether it's communicating and connecting, teaching, having fun, or dealing with challenges, it's just being the awareness that underlies every one of those exchanges. All right. So, what's a good thing to do? First of all, so try to be present by eliminating distractions. It's impossible to eliminate all of them, but when it's go time in the house and everybody's around and people are doing things, it's probably not a good idea to be holed up in a room on devices, right? Parents, but not for the kids either, for that matter, right? But it's probably a good idea to kind of just be focused and aware, at least, of what might be happening. And again, I mean, I work with adults all the time that they get home from work and they go on Facebook, and they're on Facebook all night. This is not an exaggeration. That's their life. Looking at other people's lives. And then there's internal distractions due to life situations. We've talked about that a little bit. Stress, anxiety, depression. I mean, you know, life situations and life, they're not the same things. Life situations are just content. Life is a much different thing. Life is what underlies the situations. It's not who and what we are. And that's important to make a distinction about that. And then I think it's important to try to be present by examining what our purpose is in the communications we have with our kids. So what does that mean? That means that try to clarify the goal. The clarification of the goal belongs at the beginning, since this is going to determine the outcome of any interaction. Right? So in any situation where you're uncertain, consider the question, what do I want to come from this? And so in order to do that, there has to be a pause, a gap, a space. Calming down, what do I want to come from this? That will drive the interaction. It's better to act and not react, so stop, breathe, think, and choose are 4 good words to remember. I mean, if you're too upset with something you've seen or something that's happened, that's not the best time to deal with that, right? Calm down, create a gap, and then allow yourself to deal with it out of creating the space around the event, right? It's a much more sane approach. And try to see the purpose in the challenges that we experience. Like we said in the beginning, Carl Jung, there's no coming to consciousness without pain. Every single one of the things that go wrong. You know, people come in, obviously my day is filled with people who come in talking about the stuff that's going wrong, right? I said, that's great. What do you mean? There's a tremendous opportunity in this. All of these challenges are here so that we can learn. We can evolve, we can wake up. Can pay attention to the hole in the street we fell in yesterday. These are great opportunities for higher consciousness and awareness. So every time you create a gap in the otherwise incessant stream of thinking, as Eckhart Tolle might say, your light of consciousness grows stronger. And it's really true. You don't come from a reactive place. You don't come from pain. You come from allowing whatever form that challenge takes to be there. Because where else is it? It's here. So let's stop and think and ask, what do I want to have come from this? How can I use this situation? It's not here accidentally. There aren't any accidents. This is an opportunity to wake up, to look at the different personas, the different sides of ourselves that are in there, and come from the stronger, wiser self. Okay. Trying to be present by watching our own messaging and leading by example with, for example, the use of alcohol. How do we drink? You know, what are we saying and how we use alcohol? 90% of human communication is nonverbal. That's frightening, right? So they're like watching everything. And they know where alcohol is in the house, right? So it's useful to maybe think about during this era, to think about securing it, right? Because, there's one more slide. Friends will, it might not be your child, but friends will also know where the alcohol's kept, right? And they'll come over and raid the alcohol cabinet. And then I have there what I call the reverse miracle, you know, where water was changed to wine. Well, suddenly your wine is changed back to water because they drink the wine and then fill the wine bottle with water. It's like that miracle. It's unbelievable, right? How'd that happen? It wasn't me. It was Tim, next door neighbor, right? And telling useful stories, right? Useful stories probably, I mean, they might be funny and they might be part of family lore that maybe the other adults around the house can share laughingly when the kids aren't around. But useful stories probably wouldn't be stories that talk about how glamorous drinking has been and what funny, outrageous things have happened in the past. There's messaging there, right? So you gotta, you know, tell good stories like, yeah, wow, that's really bad because, yeah, Uncle Chuck got arrested and he spent 2 years in jail. It was awful, right? Those are important things, but not how glamorous it is. But common sense, right? Messaging becomes important. All right. Go back. And trying to be present through strength, not fear. You know, fear of consequences. Fear of, you know, if we use consequences, that somehow that's a bad thing, right? Setting limits, it's okay. That's part of teaching, right? They're not going to think it's great, but it makes sense. Fear of losing our connection with the child. Children inherently love their parents. If we consequence them for doing something wrong, they're not going to pack up and move out and hate us for the rest of their lives. It's temporary. It's temporary. It's not permanent. And then the fear of not knowing what to do, that's fearful. You can't possibly know everything to do, right? So it's good to reach out, call for help. Call a family member, call a neighbor who maybe had raised older kids. What'd you do, right? Call someone you have faith in, right? That's an important thing to be able to reach out. I always like to tell people, if your car broke down in the Mass Pike, would you pull it off the road and camouflage it? Probably not, right? Why not? Well, no one would see me. Stronger, wiser self, right? That's in there. So, coming from parenting strengths, trying to be consistent in our message. We already talked about presence. Being straightforward and clear. You know, there was interesting statistics on the stuff that you guys did here in the district, right? That when we send a very clear message, like your brain is developing faster than it ever was, you do not want to compromise it. The trouble that it can create both internally, externally, socially in your life is crazy. Do not do it. Don't. Because honestly, there's so many mixed messages about it. You know, drinking is this like this normalized thing, right? Normal doesn't mean healthy. Normal is a statistical term that means common, right? So drinking's kind of saying, you know, something that's not so bad, as long as you're drinking in the house. As long as you're drinking, and this is like 15 minutes, drinking in the house, or if you have your license, underage drinking still, unless you're not driving, you're drinking with family members. So, the message got to be straightforward and clear. And just a word about the 4 horsemen. I talked about flooding, but in communication, it's best, it's again, the reason to calm down, because if there's harsh startups are perceived as criticism, and as soon as it's perceived as criticism, what happens? The walls go up, defensiveness starts, right? And then stonewalling. I'm not talking about this. And the last one's contempt, where we're the wiser, and we're just teaching you everything you know about life. And then these lectures go on for hours, right? So we don't want to have the 4 horsemen there. And the struggle you're in today is developing the strength you need for tomorrow, so don't give up. All right. Almost at the end. Oh, sorry. So, being present by building a child's strength narrative. So I talked about this a little bit earlier. I just want to touch on this for a moment. And this becomes an incredibly important piece. And I love this parable about the beggar in the box. Have you ever heard this parable? Ever heard? This is a really cool parable. This beggar sitting on this box in this village, and he's been sitting there for years begging for money. And so he got the cup out, give me some money. And this passerby walks by and says, "Hey, what's in the box?" The beggar says, "I have no idea. I've been sitting on this thing for years." And the beggar says, the passerby says, "No, seriously, what's in the box? Why don't we open it up now? Look at, just give me some money. I have no idea what's in there. I've been sitting on this thing for years." So the passerby talks the beggar into opening the box. They open the box, and lo and behold, all the riches in the world he's been sitting on, right? And not knowing it. The inner narrative, the stronger, wiser self is in there. That's a part of who they are. So self-esteem is the relationship that we have with ourselves in thought. That's it. Our value, children's value, it doesn't rise or fall. How can you have more value at that thing and less value at that thing with those people? The only thing that makes it appear that way is the inner story. I'm this, I'm that, I'm not this, I don't have this, I'm not like that, I'm not this, I'm not... And there's a distortion in the perception of a person's value. So we want to create a strength narrative. We want them to know that. That's why we want to ask questions. What would you do in a situation like this? They have answers. Sometimes my job is incredibly easy. I just ask questions. That's it. It's in there. A lot of times it's in there. Sometimes it's not, but that's a little more work, but it's in there. So we manifest, that's what we see. What comes out of someone is what's inside. So if someone's acting hurt and depressed and insecure, it's because that's the inner narrative. That's what you're seeing, a reflection of what's happening inside. Let's work on the inner narrative, right? Thoughts become stories, and stories become filters for perception. So if someone is unbelievably insecure about who they are and they see absolutely no strengths, you can go on AuthenticHappiness.org, completely free, and there's this VIA, Virtues and Actions, Strengths Survey for kids. And so what you get when the kid takes this for free is the antithesis of the DSM-5, which tells you everything that's wrong with everybody, right? You can't come away from that test without identifying your top 5 character strengths. These are your gifts. This is what's in you. There's an adult version of this too. That may become the foundational building block for changing the inner narrative, right? We want to make sure we're hitting that. Right, how they see themselves. And then, last couple of things. Positive connections are important. Lots of times young people measure themselves in terms of the number of friends they have. It has nothing to do with numbers. It's the quality, right? Right? One good friend, that's all you need. It's amazing when you ask young people sometimes, how many friends do you need? not a trick question. Really trying to, how many friends do you need? 11? 12? Really? How come? I mean, isn't it hard to keep track of all that? I mean, there's a lot of social media stuff you got to respond to with 12. What if you just had one? And they were like the salt of the earth, thought the world of you, would be there for you in anything, and you'd be there for them. Is that worth more than having 12 people that might not care about you? And then you're becoming the surrogate frontal lobe, right? Helping them think through and begin to change the narrative. But friends, quality, not quantity. Professionals can be people to connect with. Charismatic adults in any walk of life. Someone who has a powerful influence by virtue of who they are. They can be unbelievable aids in messaging. Sports and activities, obviously, churches, temples, great places for connections. If you want to read a really good book, it was written a number of years ago. It was written by Ed Hallowell, called The Childhood Roots to Adult Happiness. A great book, right? It talks all about, in the first chapter, the power of connection. It's a beautiful, he does a beautiful job in that book. Yes, it's Ed Hallowell, and the name of the book is Childhood Roots to Adult Happiness. Great book. Okay, so we're back from where we started, right? So I'm hoping that this improved the stronger, wiser part of ourselves that we all have, the common sense that's underneath the panic and the fear and the anxiety, right? It's there. And if this helped create a stronger sense of that, then it worked. The only thing I would call your attention to is that on my website, there's a lot of free stuff you can access, stuff you can go to, it's in your handouts. There's a lot of vlogs, there's a lot of mass appeal appearances that I've done, a lot of self-help stuff that I put together over the past couple of years. That's all free. We're actually asking people to leave email addresses only because we're trying to launch a book shortly, and the bigger platform we have, so there's a little selfish motive there. It doesn't cost anything. And then finally, every child is gifted. They just unwrap their packages at different times. So, now, questions? Maybe not about your children, but your neighbor's kids, maybe the question. Sure. Oh, yes. I sure can. Yep. AuthenticHappiness.org. And that's all free. All right. Seriously, any question? Anything that is on your mind? Anything you'd like to share? Anything that you want to ask? So everyone is leaving. Yes. Thank God.
Very interesting information. You tend to see a lot of this anxiety in our kids, having a lot of that. I'm a high school teacher, and you just see so much of this darn anxiety
Yes.
in these kids that is so troubling and upsetting for parents and kids alike. It just seems every year it's getting worse or worse, or we're becoming more aware of it every year. But this, this whole environment, being so nervous and
Yes.
afraid of everything, and just every day is just such a battle for
Yeah.
so many of these kids.
It's the world is challenge in place. And I think the answer to the problem with that is not trying to interfere with developing your narrative around the content of your life situations. The world's, it's a tough place to live. I mean, it's filled with all kinds of adversity and challenges, and it's fast-paced, and there's a lot of information, much more content to manage, much more stuff to deal with than really ever before, right? And I think it's changed largely due to the technology which is phenomenal on one hand, but making all of this stuff instantly available and accessible just absolutely takes up so much room. So much so that there's no break in thinking. There's no gaps. There's no, like, lots of times being able to go out and say, God, that's a beautiful sunset. Or that forest is really cool. Or that beach is like so calm. And the reason for that is because when, we manifest what we see. So when there's all kinds of stress inside, it's impossible to see anything calm or beautiful or great because we can't see what we don't have in ourselves to identify with it. So it's there's a lot of work in teaching kids how to calm down, stop thinking, don't identify with thought patterns, look for the stronger, wiser self in you that's there, right? The deeper presence that underlies all that noise, right? And getting people in touch with that, that's a very powerful shift. It's huge. And when people make that shift, and young people make it as well, it changes things significantly. So that's a really good question. Very poignant. Yes. Yes.
I'm a registered nurse and I work in a hospital with those young kids doing heroin at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I had, as a young girl, I dealt with anxiety and depression and all this. And then I found out that the only thing that really helped me, the craziness in the head, was going out riding on a horse for 5 hours, and I felt like a totally different person. And hiking up a mountain, and then I was able to focus. I think that's the hard time. Kids have a hard time focusing on things because, and like I had a young kid that lived with me for a while, and his parents put him on all kinds of medication because he had ADD, and they drugged the kid up, and they couldn't control him. And I think that's what's happening to a lot of young kids nowadays. Instead of alternative therapy, which is riding a horse for 5 hours,
Right.
or getting out of the mall, or going shopping and being on, when I worked in the ER, I had a young kid that wanted to commit suicide, and just listening to him was, they had me on the board of doctors, and they said, well, how come you're so successful? I just listened to him. That's all I wanted.
That's great.
And there's a lot of, it's a big thing out of nothing. And I think farming was farming was a really good thing in our community. They made kids get close to animals. And
That's a great story. And I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, I think that, finding things that you love to do that aren't necessarily a digital related kind of experience and making room and space to experience other things in life. Sometimes kids come in and adults come in so worked up with anxiety and stress that sometimes the goal in that moment is just to say, stop. Not a disrespectful stop, just stop for a moment. And how does that feel? How does it feel to be in touch with just no thinking, right? Tough thing to turn off sometimes, and it's a real torment when you can't. So going out in nature, riding horses and being outside and having those kinds of experiences where you can begin to connect with an entirely different set of experiences is powerful. And I couldn't agree more. I'm not saying there isn't a place for medication, because there really is. However, not when it's used for the wrong reasons or overused and mistargeted. Right? That's really a travesty when that happens. Yes.
Another question is, when you have that chromosome, defective chromosome,
Yes.
what do they cure? Is there a cure? There's no really cure for that.
Well, the interesting thing is about DNA and genetics is that we can change our genetics by changing our behavior, which is a fascinating thing. Meaning that if you look up neuroplasticity, you will see that neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to rewire itself and restructure itself based on the way we think and the way we behave. So ultimately, it is true that if you stop drinking and that begins to be handed down generationally, it changes the DNA marker. And that's true of a lot of things genetically, which is something we never knew until we began to have much more advanced science in terms of studying the brain. PET scan imaging and MRIs and CAT scans and all that stuff. We used to believe for years that the brain was not changeable after the age of like 40. And now we know that the brain rewires and restructures itself up until the time we die, and that could be into your 90s or hundreds. So it's pretty fascinating, the power that changing behavior and changing the way you think changes physiology. Again, it's just a powerful statement, but we manifest that which we see. It's powerful stuff. Anything else? Yes.
I don't want to discourage more questions, but I also want to ask you to please take this moment, if you haven't already, to fill out your evaluations. And we will be doing our door prize drawing at the very end, so please stay put, because you have to be present to win. But I don't want to discourage more questions, and I actually have a question, Rob. I know that for some parents, we struggle when our kids begin to ask us questions about our own experiences, our college years, things like that. So do you have any advice for parents who are confronting those kinds of questions?
With their kids going off to colleges?
Well, whatever.
I think the most powerful form of talking is basically around being able to ask the right questions and get them to think through the answers. Does that get through it a little bit?
Okay, so what did you do, Dad, when you went to a party? Dad?
Well, that's where I think you have to be very careful about the narrative. And I think that the tendency sometimes, especially with alcohol, is to have all these hilariously funny stories built around it. And they are, to a matter of degree, but they're not the type of messaging that you necessarily want to share with your developing adolescent, right? Because they'll hear the glamorous side of the story, and that will become like that, oh God, that's like so cool, my dad's uncle, and they went out to this, and all of a sudden they stole this cow and they were riding around in a thing. And then next thing you know, that's what they're doing, right? So it's better to think of the more powerful narratives about why it was bad. And then maybe save those when they're grown up and they come home and you can share those things and laugh. Does that make sense? All right. So yeah, so you might not tell them the truth about the fun stuff, but tell them the truth about the challenging stuff. Question?
More so a comment. In the beginning of this presentation, you spoke about middle school.
Yes.
The drinking coming more so with middle schoolers. Where are they getting it? I want to know, like, is it adult with peer pressure? Is it their own, siblings?
You mean the urge to use?
The urge to use and the actual alcohol.
Yeah.
And if you're talking to a school district that is, going to be thinking about, putting middle schoolers with high schoolers.
Yeah.
That's an alarming statistic.
Right.
That blew me away, and I thought, I was pretty much, finger on the pulse type of thing. That statistic about middle schoolers really troubled me.
Right. Gina, do you want to cover that? Do you want to say something?
So we do ask, among the questions that we ask, we ask, where does it come from? Typically, as Rob said, the reverse miracle, it is coming from, they're not going into the Big Y and buying it. So very typically in those early experimental years, it is coming from home, or potentially an older sibling, which again is home. And so that is the most typical in those middle school years. When we ask the same question of our high school students, then that broadens out a little bit more. And we also ask at home without my parents' knowledge or consent, at home with my parents' knowledge. So I think it again comes down to that just awareness, that clarity of expectation. And you know, we survived 4 children, but I really recall, like, we used to send our oldest down to the basement to play Nintendo, not really thinking about the fact that that's also where the alcohol was, you know, like, so, oh, all right, that's not a good idea. So I think it's really just kind of that environmental scan of our homes and really thinking about, as we talk about like locking up our medicine, also just being aware. It really, at that age in particular, unfortunately, I think it is the home environment that where the access might be.
Right, I get that.
Yeah.
What about the peer pressure? I mean, is it peer pressure? Is it, you know, thinking about high schoolers influencing middle schoolers?
Yeah, I mean,
that really
you know,
opens
it doesn't, normally, it doesn't happen in a vacuum where one kid at that young age decides by him or herself, I'm just going to get wasted. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but a lot of it's driven by this group mind. And it may be one other person.
Right.
One other friend who wants to do this, and they convince each other that would be cool, and they have absolutely no idea of what they're doing because they binge drink. So that, you know, they down a half a liter of vodka and they end up in base ADR. That's not an uncommon story because they don't have any clue, right? But a lot of it is hatched in conversation, and you know, this would be kind of a cool thing, and they know where they can get this stuff in people's homes, like you said. You know, where the liquor. I hear that all the time, and for many years. You know, so and so's house, the liquor's over the refrigerator. You know, you just go in, you help yourself, you fill the thing with water, put the thing back up, and you know that's where they get it. Older siblings are sometimes involved, which is not cool. And then when in that case, you know, it's fun to call the older sibling in, and you know, so what were you thinking, right? What are the consequences? You know, there's a responsibility to being an older sibling, right? But a lot of it's the group stuff. It's powerful, you know, which is why, you know, teaching them, front-loading the opting out stuff is key. Like, so, you know, your friend says, let's go do this, let's go grab alcohol at the Smith's house. How are you going to get out of that? Have you thought of that? They're not going to do that. Seriously, have you thought of that? Because it's bound to happen. So, you know, we don't want to ignore it. We want to just say, let's just front load this thing and see if we can kind of get some stuff in there that might not normally be thought of just because of the immaturity of the thinking process at that age.
So in other words, giving them an opt-out
Yes.
conversation.
Blame your parents. We're really
Sure.
idiots. They can't believe we're the worst parents in the world. I'd be sent to some kind of prison if I ever got them. Whatever. That's fine.
Very good.
Unfortunately, you see the turnout here. And this is the turnout at Chris Herron, this is the turnout at gun control, this is the turnout at all things. And I don't want to say parents don't care. Parents are busy, parents are 2 working families, parents have sports commitments. It's hard, but I don't know why we cannot fill these auditoriums when we have things like this. You use the word, when you were talking about Corona, it's romantic. Alcohol is romanticized to these kids. You go to a wedding. I hate taking my kids to weddings. I hate taking my kids to family functions because they see adults having a great time getting drunk. Unfortunately, that's what they see. So they can't wait to grow up and have a good time with alcohol because that's what adults are showing them, that it's a great time. And the lesson begins in the home, with any of it.
That's
with
true.
Any of it. I wish, and I know, Al, you are the budget man, and the budget's tough, but the programs have to come. The kids need more of this kind of stuff because the parents don't come. So it has to be driven in the school day, that there's got to be more programming for them because they will soak it up. I mean, I talk to my kids about it all the time because I don't want to lose my kid to alcohol or drugs or gun violence or any of it. You know what I mean? It is talked about in our home on a daily basis. Our family is affected by alcohol and drug use, so it is
There
talked
aren't many
about
that
all
aren't.
the time. You know
No,
what I
listen, I
mean?
hear
So I don't know, but again, I don't know what goes on when they go to a friend's house, you know what I mean? But I say, call. I don't let other parents drive them because I don't know if they're getting in the car after they've had drinks. You know,
And that's a
again,
good
you
thing,
have
by
to
the way.
be an advocate for your own kid because you can't trust what other parents are doing. And I might sound like a control-free parent, and I am a control-free parent.
It's that constant communication too.
It is.
It's the
It really
constant.
is.
And again, I'm a dad of 3. You know, we had teenagers all at the same time, and it was the message we were delivering in our house when our oldest, who were obviously all of us were the strictest with our oldest, right? He was the first one, right? But he was going to a friend's house that they might have been the 3rd or 4th sibling in the house, right? And so we all know as the 2nd and 3rd, things get a little bit less stressful as parents. But the God was down in those houses that we're going to, and that my son was going to. So it was a constant message that we had to deliver to Al and say, listen, no matter where you are, this is the expectation. We pretend we're watching you at all the time. And my wife and I, and I'm sorry, we used to, when they used to go out, we still, even now, my youngest is just at UConn, we send them a text every now and then, just make good choices. That's all we do, text-wise. We just send it all the time. So even my 24-year-old, you know, when he's out in Boston, just make good choices. Just as a constant reminder, we text them and say, make good choices all the time. Because it's that constant message.
That's great. And I think it is a powerful thing to communicate with other parents about calling ahead and seeing, you know, who's going to be home and what's going on. No young person I ever work with says, that is such a good thing. What a great tool. You know, keep calling because I love that. They hate it. But it's really important.
Yeah, well,
Because
apparently
you can't-
96% of Wolverham parents call when their kids go to another house party.
What's that?
96%, isn't that amazing?
They call.
Oh, yeah. Meanwhile, I can't tell you how many kids I've had at my house. I haven't had more than, less than this on hand. But it says it right here, 96% of Wolverham
It might
parents
be a poor cell phone area.
call. I mean, are we believing on all this stuff? This is crazy.
So I'm going to have to take a peek at that. I am hoping that what it was intended in our very small survey was 96% so that they would welcome a call, but that might not be what it says. So I thank you. But truly, wouldn't you welcome a call? Of course you would. Absolutely. I think we all
I
would.
made the call.
You're making the call, and your kids know that you're making that call, and that is really important. So, Dan, thank you for
That's really
that.
important.
It really is. And it's not a favorite thing, so, but you
No,
gotta
no,
hustle
usually
through
it's
that.
one of them, usually
Exactly.
the parents at home,
Yeah.
they don't like that either, but we do.
It looks like
I'm doing
we.
this because I love you. Yes.
I also think that we have a choice to, as our friends, parents, and say your daughter or son is friend with my son or daughter, to have that conversation.
It's great.
I don't think we have that within our kids' groups of parents, so that you don't know what's happening in that other household. And so then, I think that we as adults need to have those conversations with our kids' friends and
No
parents.
question. Great stuff to talk
And they
about.
don't.
Yeah, you know, and you know, I mean, you look at numbers. I mean, some people may be busy. Finally, we get one nice day in spring, right? Everybody's out walking or sports. This is going to be on, I think, public access. So a lot of people may opt to see this through that. So that's a cool thing, right? I think that, look at, we're all here, and, you can only start with yourself in changing the way the world works, right? So if this dialogue we've had changes the consciousness that each person has in this room, and that leads to changing the consciousness in another person, that is absolutely a very powerful trajectory. That's how we change things. That's how the world changes, right? One person at a time. And I'm not trying to be corny. I'm dead serious about that. That's powerful stuff. It's amazing the power that one person changing can affect countless numbers of other people. Honest.
I think I saw maybe 2 more questions. Go ahead.
I just wanted to, I don't want to be the know-it-all group, but I just want to make one comment about the Facebook, and you can fact check me with these lovely ladies sitting in the first 2 rows. I was corrected the other night by my kids when they clearly told me that Facebook is for old people, and the kids are really, they're not putting the truth out or what's really going on Facebook. I know that that's for old people and that's for parents, and parents are on there. So if you think that you're getting pretty much a good idea of what's going on in your child's life just by looking at Facebook, you're dead wrong. Yes.
Well, there's others, right?
And most of them are on Instagram, they're on where the posts don't stay up or the pictures, Snapchat for more than a minute.
Right.
And if you were to take a picture, even in dark on somebody, they know you took the picture and that you were the one. So they don't dare do it to each other either, because if you want to be outcasted, that's a sure way to do it. But please don't take any false confidence in that your kid is not involved in certain things because you just don't see it on Facebook.
That's a really good point.
So that was the first thing that I wanted to say. And then the second thing that I wanted to say, kind of back up what the ladies over there said, was if there is a way to bring this conversation to parents with younger children. My husband, or my children's father, and his father were both raging alcoholics. And from the time that my kids were 5 years old, we had open and honest discussions about drinking. Why, how, when, what's appropriate, who's watching.
Good.
And, we even role play with somebody, what are you gonna say when somebody hands you a joint? What are you gonna say when somebody hands you a bottle?
Powerful.
And they're all looking at you, waiting for you to take a sip. And how hard is that to have the courage to, again, possibly be outcasted, but to know what to say? And we've been talking about it for years and years and years
That's
and
awesome.
years.
Great stuff.
And thank God, too, because both of my kids didn't find it too much here, but my daughter graduated last year, and she's at Westfield State now. She was so happy, I'm going off to a new college, I can reinvent myself, nobody knows me there, and I'm gonna have all these friends. Well, the partying is going on, and the minute they realize that she doesn't drink, she doesn't need to drink, she doesn't want to drink, because there's a chance that she could be, and have that alcoholic gene, they just don't invite her anymore. So there's peer pressure in that as well. You want to fit in, and I tell her, I'm glad that you can sacrifice the choice. But there's really so much more to this conversation that I think the more that people are talking about it and are willing to speak openly and honestly about it, are we ever going to get anywhere?
Yeah, great comment. Great observation, great comment, great job.
Do I see one more question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What do you think about teaching children at a young age about meditation and perhaps maybe yoga, and as a way to be able to calm themselves from things that others have mentioned, like anxiety or leading to self-medication?
So that's a great question, and I think it's probably one of the more powerful interventions kids can learn at a young age, without question. And it's great to see a lot of that stuff beginning to show up in mental health offices, yoga classes, meditation classes. You know, the website up here that I posted, that we have a website that I created. There's a relaxation meditation script available there. But that stuff is really critical to learn at a young age. Because like I said, I mean, the mind's a wonderful gift, but not if you can't turn it off. And we don't want to rely on alcohol and drugs to turn off an anxious mind. There's a lot of other more powerful things that you can use that are healthy and safe and actually quite much more effective. So, thank you. Great question.
I was wondering if that was.
Yeah, great question. And I think Heart Song Center in East Long Meadow, you've heard this place?
Yeah.
Heart Song Center in East Long Meadow runs, I think they run stuff for kids over there. And there's a lot of things available for yoga and meditation for children. And, you know, a lot of stuff, writing, journaling stuff. I know one of our therapists in the office, Steve O'Palinick, does a lot of work with yoga and, you know, physical stuff with kids. So it's this new age psychology is great to see it. But great observation and great question, because that is powerful stuff. Yes?
What was the name of that book again that you recommended?
Oh, Ed Hallowell's book?
What is it?
Ed Hallowell's book. It's called Childhood Roots to Adult Happiness.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a good book.
Another.
Yeah, and it's a good book I wanted to mention too. John Ratey, R-A-T-E-Y. He's a medical doctor. He's a colleague of Ed Hallowell. They actually co-authored the book Delivered from Distraction about ADHD. But John Ratey authored a book called Spark, and that's worth reading because it's a book about how exercise impacts mental health and brain physiology. And that's a really powerful book to equip yourself about how movement and exercising and things like that can really change the physiology of any purpose. It's called Spark, S-P-A-R-K. John Ratey, R-A-T-E-Y. Great book.
That's why our kids have such anxiety today.
Oh, yeah.
Because they don't do the exercise.
Right.
They don't.
Yeah. And this district has an unbelievable sports program. A lot of kids are active doing a lot of things, but there's still so many kids all over the place that are spending just time, in video games. It's unbelievable, right? And that's like taking a depressant medication. It's not an antidepressant. When you don't exercise, it's like taking a depressant. It changes the physiology. And then what happens? Then people want to start using drugs and alcohol to change their physiology. So good questions and good observations.
To give Dr. Rob a big thank you for coming out tonight, and a big thank you to all of you. Thank you for being here. We have just a couple things to keep in mind. You can go right on the Coalition website. We'll have the video on the program tonight, as well as a lot of different resources. Write in your package that you have when you came in the auditorium, parent perspective survey, information about the youth mental health first aid program that's offered in the community. And we have another event coming up on May 23rd if you'd like to attend, if you have graduating seniors, things you'd like to know before they go. And your evals, the gold sheets in your folders will be passed in at the door as you exit. And now, drum roll, we have the door prize drawing. Tracy, you're gonna come and help. I'd like to invite Tracy Beducci to come up and help. We're gonna draw some names, and good luck to the lucky winners. What do we have first? Oh, all right, I'll let Dr. Rob. Oh, pick two?
Pick two.
We have 2 tickets for Ultimate Party. All right, thank you, Dr. Rob. And Isabella Ferraro, come on. We have Patricia Arroyne. All right. All right, $25 for Rice Farm. We have Nora Trevon.
Ice cream on Nora, thank you.
Yes. Rice Farm tomorrow.
We're heading right over there.
All right, Skentic Valley membership. is going out to Sheila M. Harrington. Is Sheila here tonight? All right, and a t-shirt. Congratulations. And the Big Y gift certificate is Bev Cremio.
Thank you. This is Bruce DeCristoforo, our coalition coordinator. Our youth communications and youth liaison. I want to say one thing about Ultimate Party. There were 2 Ultimate Party tickets in the prize bins. The Ultimate Party Inc., I'm not sure how many years. Has it been 30? I don't know. It's some huge number. This is an annual, substance-free, safe post-graduation party, entirely volunteer-run. When we talk about community messaging, when we talk about helping parents convey that expectation to kids, here is a fabulous organization that in our community for decades has represented this message. And I know that you folks are probably here because you have older children, so you know about it, but that message is so important to spread out into the community because it only works if our volunteers continue to keep on coming as children grow and go off to college. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rob, for your phenomenal, as always, program. And please, as you leave your evaluations. Have a wonderful and safe evening. Good night.